In our headlines at this hour, President Yoon Suk-yeol presided over his first regular cabinet meeting on this Thursday at the Sejong government complex, urging for all-out efforts on state affairs. Seoul Central Bank has raised its benchmark interest rate to 1.75% on this Thursday, with Governor Lee Chang-yong highlighting the importance of curbing inflation. And the U.S. State Department has strongly condemned North Korea's latest missile launches and urged the international community to join in efforts to discourage such acts of provocation. Welcome to the Daily Report. It's Thursday afternoon, May 26th here in South Korea. I'm Min Sun-hee. President Yoon Suk-yeol has presided over his first regular cabinet meeting at the Sejong government complex. All of his cabinet members were present at this morning's meeting, with the exception of his ministers of Education and Health, whose nominations were only announced earlier on this Thursday as well. Now, Yoon had previously held an extraordinary cabinet meeting in Yongsan to approve an extra budget proposal. Also earlier today, President Yoon handed his cabinet members their certificates of appointment. And as widely expected, the Bank of Korea has raised its key interest rate to 1.75%, with Governor Lee Chang-yong highlighting the importance of fighting escalating inflation. Our Ji-young reports.
South Korea's central bank has raised its key interest rate 2 times in a row for the first time in 15 years. The Bank of Korea hiked the base rate to 1.75%, up a quarter percentage point amid soaring consumer prices. The decision was made during the bank's policy meeting on Thursday in an attempt to rein in the country's inflation, which is nearing 5%. The rate hike comes just 1 month after the central bank raised the key interest rate by 25 basis points. This also marks the 5th increase since the BOK slashed its rate to a record low of 0.5% in May 2020 due to virus woes. The government has been pursuing a tighter monetary policy since August last year amid growing global inflationary pressure. Now the benchmark rate has been set at even higher than the 1.25% from just before the outbreak of COVID-19. Thursday's rate decision meeting was the first one presided over by new BOK Governor Lee Chang-yong, who had been signaling rate hikes. He has been indicating that inflation is the BOK's policy priority. The bank is seeing faster inflation this year with inflation rate forecasts of 4.5%. It's the highest in almost 14 years and up from the previous 3.1% forecast made in February. This comes as South Korea's consumer prices are seeing the biggest on-year increase since October 2008 during the global financial crisis. The country's consumer price index last month surged by 4.8% from the year before, well above the government's inflation target of 2%. The Bank of Korea also said the economy is likely to sustain sound recovery this year, with growth projected at 2.7%. But that figure has seen 0.3 percentage point slash from the projection made in February. It said the growth will be led by increased private spending with the lifting of social distancing measures, but due to the global economic slowdown, export growth is expected to fall. Ji-young, Arirang News.
And in the U.S., policymakers at the Federal Reserve appear prepared to push ahead with several half percentage point interest rate hikes over the next few meetings amid efforts to rein in soaring inflation. Minutes from the Fed's May meeting released on Wednesday show members remain dedicated to tackling inflation as stressed by Chairman Jerome Powell. Meanwhile, the Fed's policy-making arm, the Federal Open Market Committee, meets next in June and again in late July. Also, the U.S. remains committed to engaging with North Korea on humanitarian grounds, despite the regime's persistent provocations, which the Biden administration has sternly denounced. Our Kim Yo-sun has more.
Washington will continue to support providing COVID-19 help for North Korea, despite the regime's latest missile provocations. Mark Lambert, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Japan and South Korea, said in a virtual press briefing Wednesday that the U.S. stance remains unchanged, even in light of recent provocations by the North. He explained that the U.S. has always viewed humanitarian assistance as a separate issue from achieving complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The senior diplomat also underscored that the U.S. remains open to dialogue with Pyongyang. During a separate briefing, State Department Press Secretary Ned Price called on the international community to condemn the North's latest missile launches. Strongly renouncing the regime for its latest provocations, he also called on countries to implement UN Security Council sanctions on the regime. The remarks come on the heels of the North's firing of 3 ballistic missiles early Wednesday, which marked its 17th show of force this year. North Korea's escalatory action was met with criticism by the UN. Speaking with journalists on Wednesday, a UN spokesman said the regime's provocation only continues to escalate regional and global tensions. Against this backdrop, a senior U.S. government official says that the UNSC will vote on Washington-led sanctions against the North in the coming days. Citing the official, Reuters explained that the measures would include banning tobacco and cutting oil exports to Pyongyang. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Satellite imagery of North Korea's Yongbyon Nuclear Research Center appears to show signs of active operations at its 5-megawatt reactor and uranium enrichment plant. The North Korea tracking website 38 North has reported a higher than normal number of vehicles around the reactor between late April and mid-May, including several cargo trucks and as many as 3 tractor trailers. Improvements around the complex have also been spotted, such as the construction of new buildings, the expansion of a dam and near the enrichment plant, that is, and the return of 3 specialized rail cars. 38 North believes these activities suggest a longer-term investment in advancing the regime's nuclear weapons program. Meanwhile, a senior official at Seoul's foreign ministry believes the recent summit between President Yoon and his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden has set in motion South Korea's efforts to expand its presence within and commitment to regional peace and prosperity. My colleague Oh Soo-young sat down with him.
From tackling North Korea's provocations to dealing with geopolitical tensions and threats to economic security, South Korea is already expanding the scope of its cooperation to become a global pivotal state. That's according to the Director General of North American Affairs at Seoul's Foreign Ministry. Im Sang-woo told Arirang News on Thursday that the May 21st summit held by President Yoon and his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden set the tone for South Korea's value-based diplomacy.
It was a great meeting of minds with similar outlook and similar values, because I think they were able to formulate a real trusting relationship, because they both have this clear belief, like steadfast belief in our shared values, core values of freedom, democracy, and human rights.
Based on these core values, Im says South Korea is working to expand its role as a key partner in addressing a range of global issues, starting with Seoul's trilateral ties with Washington and Tokyo. The diplomat says the 3 countries share many common challenges to regional and economic security beyond the North Korea agenda. Regarding the pressure on South Korea to choose between its greatest security partner, the US, and its largest trading partner, China, Im said that Seoul's relations with these 2 countries are not mutually exclusive.
Our new government has repeatedly said that it will pursue a really healthy, strong relationship with China too, based on mutual respect, and we're talking constantly with our Chinese counterparts. So, bottom line is that we can develop our relationship with U.S. and at the same time with China.
The Director General says South Korea is working on its own Indo-Pacific strategy to map out and expand the reach of Seoul's policies to promote freedom, human rights and liberal democracy. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
On the international front, Russia's offensive in eastern Ukraine is marking a fresh chapter of brutality as Kremlin seeks complete control of the Donbas region. Min Soo-kyun has the latest.
Russian forces are launching fresh assaults on towns in eastern Ukraine. One of them is aimed at the city of Severodonetsk, which has been under intense artillery and missile attacks in recent days. The head of the Luhansk region administration, Serhiy Hadai, said Russia was seeking to completely destroy the city in an attempt to seize the Donbas region near Russia's border. He said the area was now without gas and has limited water and electricity. But it's not only Severodonetsk that's seeing heavy attacks. The nearby city of Lysychansk has also become a deadly battlefield. Russia is deploying thousands of troops into the Donbas region, carrying out attacks from several sides in a bid to encircle Ukrainian forces. Should Russia succeed, that will leave the whole of the Luhansk province under Moscow's control. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky raised concerns over the latest attacks in East Ukraine, saying that its forces are being outnumbered.
The armed forces of Ukraine, our intelligence service and all those who defend the state are opposing a brutal offensive by Russian troops in the east. In some places, the enemy heavily outnumbers us, by equipment, by the number of soldiers. The Russian authorities have made a landmark decision. They have allowed older people to be recruited for contract service. In other words, they no longer have enough young men, but they still have the will to fight.
Zelensky pleaded for more military assistance from the West, saying that full support without exceptions and restrictions is needed to win the war. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
Well, that brings us to the end of part 1 of the Daily Report. In part 2, we touch upon the suspected COVID-19 situation in North Korea. Stay with us.
What matters?
Welcome back. On today's segment of Viewpoint, we address North Korea's suspected COVID-19 crisis after confirming its first outbreak of Omicron on May 12th. That is precisely 2 weeks ago. North Korean authorities claim fever cases have been raging across the nation since late April. For more on the situation across the border, I have Professor David Kwok from Soonchang University. Professor Kwok, welcome back.
Good afternoon.
I also have Professor Justin Fenders at Tongseok University live on the line. Professor Fenders, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Kwok, we'll start here then. As of Thursday, North Korea says over 10% of its roughly 26 million people have fallen ill with fever, and 68 people have lost their lives. What do these tallies tell you about the situation up in North Korea?
Well, it tells us that the situation in North Korea is quite worrisome and dire right now, because they're not detecting these cases by testing methods, but instead they're actually counting people who are coming up with symptoms. And that to constitute about more than 10% of the whole population tells us that there's a great possibility, a huge portion of the whole population is actually currently going through the infection altogether. It could be millions and millions more that are actually currently infected and still transmitting to others. And it's very worrisome because, as you know, North Korea is not so much equipped with methods to actually treat the patients, let alone treat even only the symptoms. So people who might also be vulnerable in a sense of immunocompromised people who are with underlying diseases, and also the fact that we know that the citizens of North Korea are currently known to be rather weaker in their capabilities to fight against infectious diseases, makes us worry that much more that there is a possibility that many people could possibly have died from COVID-19 already, and could also possibly die also in the coming up times of the periods that are to come up. So I think North Korea has to really open up in regards to letting people know what sorts of methods that they have to fight against COVID-19, but also how they are measuring these case numbers. Plus, they would also have to open up their borderlines so that their citizens could be treated by the nations and people who has these equipments and medicines that can actually help them, that can actually have them survive through this period of pandemic. So we have to not only keep a very close eye on it, but we have to do, I think, more than that to really help this nation out. Not only in the sense that helping a neighboring nation, but also in the sense that to really help our cousins and brothers.
Right. And Professor Fenders, I understand that you assembled a statistical model to forecast the potential impact of the pandemic in North Korea in terms of case counts, hospitalization and fatality rate. Now, do tell us a bit about your findings and how do they compare with the actual statistics disclosed by North Korea?
So at this point in the pandemic, we really have a wealth of information about Omicron virus. We know under different circumstances how quickly it spreads. We know for unvaccinated people approximately how likely they are to need hospitalization, approximately how likely they are to die. And the statistical model that we came up with combines all these numbers and also takes into account North Korea's age demographics, because it does matter whether the patient is over the age of 50 or not, because when you're over 50, the odds of hospitalization and death go up by quite a bit. So taking all these factors into account, for a full-blown national scale epidemic in North Korea, our model predicts that there will be in the vicinity of 10 million adult infections. And of those 10 million, there would be about 280,000 people who are going to need hospitalization. So these are going to be people who have difficulty breathing, who most likely will need a ventilator or some other form of medical assistance. Calculating and estimating death is a little trickier because there are a lot of underlying conditions, like Dr. Kwok mentioned, that go into that calculation. So if you have diabetes, again, your hospitalization and death rate goes goes up, and we don't really have that information. So for death, our model predicts a pretty wide range from 44,000 to about 220,000. But again, as Dr. Kwok mentioned, the medical healthcare system, the equipment in North Korea is not particularly good, and over half of the people are malnourished, so their immune systems are going to be weak. So when you take into account these kinds of national disadvantages, I would suggest that the death rates are going to be much closer to the higher end, much closer to 200,000 than they will be to 40,000. Now, I think it's probably already obvious if you've been listening carefully to numbers that the numbers our model predicts are quite different from the models that the numbers that you reported earlier. So we're getting 3 million fevers and only 68 deaths, and that's very, very different from what our model predicts. And at this point, obviously, it's not clear whether all the fevers are COVID or not. But given that we're in May and most communicable common diseases like influenza tend not to spike, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, at this time. So it seems unlikely that a lot of these fevers are from those other kinds of common diseases. And also, the rate of increase, I mean, we've literally been told that these 3 million fever cases have occurred in the last 2 weeks. That's an incredibly quick rate. So, something is not quite right here. So 3 million fever cases just doesn't add up to only 68 deaths. Even South Korea in the winter during its Omicron wave with such a high vaccination rate over 82%, I also live in South Korea, we had a death rate that was at least 100 times higher than what North Korea is currently reporting. So something here isn't right. Either the fever numbers are higher than they actually are, or the death numbers are lower than they actually are.
Right. And meanwhile, against that background then, Professor Kwok, concerns have been raised about the possibility of new variants emerging in North Korea, where the population, of course, is unvaccinated. Do you share these concerns? And if you do, what may be the broader regional implications of such a reality?
Well, I actually have two different thoughts in regard to that issue. Number one is the fact that these speculations, these worries are stemming from the fact that more the infectious, the tally, greater the chance for the variant to occur, such as it happened in South Africa, where people were not so vaccinated and there were a greater transmission among the population, creating more chances for the variation to occur. So in case of North Korea, where almost nobody, we presume, to be vaccinated currently, there's that much greater chance that more people will be infected altogether at the same time, creating yet another chance for the variations to occur. So I do think that theory is quite scientifically backed up. So there would be a chance in case of North Korea also to come up with yet another new variant. But also the thought that even for those vaccinated, once infected, there could come a new variant that could dodge the immunity created by the vaccination. So even though minor, there are some people in the scientific world claiming that for those people infected despite having been vaccinated could still come up with a new variant. So those are the two thoughts that I have about North Korea, the situation in North Korea. However, also something that's worrying me is the geographical factor, that we're geographically directly connected to North Korea. And we also know that it's the fact that these COVID-19 can also sometimes be transmitted through animals, such as felines and stray cats and whatnot. So if just in case a new variant is to occur in North Korea, and I hope this doesn't ever happen, but if a new variant occurs in North Korea, which, let's say, evades all kinds of immunity and is transmitted through animals that can travel to South Korea, that's something probably we should keep in mind and have a strict mode of screening and monitoring for any transmission that goes on in the borderline between North Korea and South Korea. But in a clinical sense, I do personally think that it's less likely. It's really not likely to happen in the sense that transmission occurring via animals. But also number two, because we've already been, not just been vaccinated, but we've had a huge wave ourselves through Omicron, we're partially, if I may belittle it a little, we're at least partially immunized against not just Omicron, but COVID-19 as a whole, just through the huge wave of the pandemic a couple months back. So I think in case if a new variant or COVID-19 itself was to be transmitted from North Korea to South Korea, I think we would have enough of a power of immunity to even still fight against that.
Right, and I hope you're right then. Professor Fenders, North Korea on Wednesday engaged in additional acts of provocation by test launching ballistic missiles. How do these blatant shows of defiance, Professor Fenders, look to affect possible medical assistance to the regime from the international community?
So initially, my feeling about these missile launches, especially the ones in January, was that they were kind of a signal for help. Because January is kind of the month where we really started to get a handle on how Omicron functioned. That's when South Korea's spike was really in full motion. And I'm sure that there were many people working for the government in North Korea, and all they do is they sit there and they read news articles and they check out things on the internet. And I'm sure that the reports that they were writing were clearly sending warning bells to the very top that, okay, this is very serious now, and we might also be in trouble too. So my initial read when they launched all those missiles in January was that perhaps that was a method to try to signal to the international community that, okay, we know we're in trouble and we would like some help, please. And at that time, I felt like the most useful thing that they could get were vaccines. Obviously, they didn't get them, but this is also the time when North Korea opened up their rail service to China, which also suggested to me, given some of the things, the proclamations that Kim Jong-un made during the fall about every grain of rice being needed and food shortage being a reality, that perhaps North Korea had reached this kind of brink where they needed outside support, food support. They had to bring supplies in, but they were afraid to do it because Omicron might come in along with it. So I felt like initially that might be the strategy, that this was kind of a messaging system. More recently, especially with President Biden's visit, it's a little less clear to me exactly what the purpose of those missiles are. Obviously, historically, most of these acts of provocation have been to try to barter for concessions with international sanctions and things like this. But given how slowly North Korea has responded to both South Korean and American offers of pandemic-related assistance, I get the feeling that they're not really sensing urgency yet, which again relates back to my skepticism about the official numbers that they're reporting. At this point, I'm skeptical that they're actually experiencing as large-scale, full-blown an epidemic as they say they are.
Right, I see. Professor Fenders mentioned this, but Professor Kwak, North Korea, with regard to offers of COVID-19 vaccines, they've reportedly rejected it, citing breakthrough infections, and they've instead requested treatment support. Now, that being said, what medical support do you believe is necessary for North Korea?
Well, honestly speaking, I think a little differently from what Professor Fenders has just mentioned. I think the North regime actually, there's also a possibility that they actually have sort of gave up on the possibility to gain an opportunity to immunize themselves in the fight against COVID-19. Maybe it's already too dire for them to handle that they don't want to receive vaccines to prevent the infection, but rather they take this as a partial opportunity to be immunized through natural infection. But because they don't want too high of a mortality rate and people not becoming severe, they're only asking for symptomatic treatments and treatments for the disease itself. So in that regard, well, through whatever these supports that we can provide, obviously we could possibly provide manpower, sending them doctors and nurses who have experiences treating COVID-19 patients here and there. But also we could provide them medicine. But because we're also running very tightly on Paxlovid and Molnupiravir and et cetera, instead of those, we could possibly think about sending them symptomatic medicines, such as acetaminophen, such as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, maybe even possibly steroids, because as currently known, I think North regime is even lacking symptomatic medicines. They're actually suggesting that people be treated through natural hermetical disease, hermetical medicine and herbal medicine and whatnot. So we could think about alternative ways that we could provide and support them in this fight against COVID-19 as well.
Right. And Professor Fenders, while we're debating over the actual size of the outbreak there in North Korea, Radio Free Asia says that the lack of proper treatment has also led to a number of stillbirths in North Korea. Now, apparently pregnant women who test positive for COVID-19 are quarantined and offered 2 painkillers a day. What look to be the broader repercussions of such inadequate medical attention, do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, it's very unfortunate when people who need a certain form of medical attention don't get it. But on a larger scale, which I think is the direction of the question, it's important to remember that the North Korean regime, Kim Jong-un's regime, is the central pillar. It's predicated on the ability to bring competent leadership. And a lot of the internal propaganda system runs on this principle of presenting the Kim Jong-un family as a superior bloodline with elite traits that is just more competent at being leaders. And this is often called the leadership myth. And when you start having enough of these kinds of cases where the government is unable to provide things that people expect to receive or should or feel like that they should be receiving, things like adequate medical attention or food, things like this, you start to erode that perception that the current leaders know what they're doing or that the current leaders are doing a good job. So individual events like this may not have such a large impact on the social fabric or the political situation, but when you start to accrue a lot of these cases, a lot of these situations where people are dissatisfied or surprised at how they're unable to receive assistance, you might have some situations now where the people start to develop enough discontent that they start to question this propaganda and this myth of superiority that the Kim Jong-un family tries to maintain. If I may respond a little bit to Dr. Kwok, I am definitely of the opinion that North Korea is going to have a national scale epidemic sooner or later. My skepticism is about the numbers that we're currently seeing that they're giving out through their media. I don't think that those numbers at this time are accurate, just because the two don't seem to agree. But I am of the opinion that eventually there will be a large-scale, national-size epidemic. And looking at it from their perspective, they've probably already given up on the idea that they can get enough vaccines to cover everybody, which may also explain why they're more interested in medicines at this time rather than vaccines.
Right, which is also something that Professor Kwok touched upon. Now, moving beyond North Korea, Professor Kwok, the last time we were here in the studio, we touched upon the rising cases of hepatitis in children. Now, in recent days, there have been growing cases of monkeypox in adults reported across Europe and the US. What more can you tell us about this fresh health challenge?
Right, so let me begin by saying monkeypox is not actually related to the animal monkeys. It's a family of smallpoxes that have already been quite thoroughly studied. They even have prevention methods and treatment antiviral agents that could treat them and also prevent them, but not enough in stocks worldwide. But we do know how it works and how it spreads. As far as we are known, the monkeypox transmits through very close contact, almost physical contact, through human fluids. So even though formally, scientifically speaking, it is known to be transmitted through respiratory droplets, that sort of a deal is more within a very proximate distance where a person is constantly coughing and sneezing, where the human fluid is actually directly touching the other person. So it's more likely the situation where a person actually comes into physical contact with another person, whether that be regardless of genders. But situationally, I think it is spreading through a very specific community, but also we have to focus on the fact that it has already transmitted to many different countries, which is not normal. We would have used to see that the monkeypox only spread very geographically, focally within the regions of West Africa and whatnot. But now seeing the fact that it has been already spread to Europe and the US, it seems like it has already spread to many other different countries that we're not currently detecting these cases from. So there is a possibility of that, and the numbers of detection may actually grow very vastly in the nearest future. But we should also take into consideration the numbers are also still small. We have barely counted about 80 confirmed cases so far, and there's a speculation up to about 50 or 60 more people could have been already infected with the monkeypox. So we still have to keep monitoring it, but I don't think it'll be as dangerous or tiresome as the COVID-19 was. In fact, I personally think that it will be absolutely no match to what COVID-19 was.
Right. Well, as Dr. Kwok has said, Professor Fenders, the global health body claims the current monkeypox outbreak reported in at least 19 countries outside of Africa is containable. Do you agree, Professor Fenders?
Yes, I do. And I think Dr. Kwok laid out the basic parameters very clearly, that the degree of intimacy required to actually transmit the disease is much more than what you have for coronavirus. I mean, coronavirus being in the wrong subway car can literally get you infected. But here we are talking about sustained contact. So I do think, given the information we have at the moment at least, that this idea of a pandemic-sized or even a serious epidemic-sized spread of the virus in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands is very unlikely.
Right. And Professor Kwok, health authorities here have claimed they are closely monitoring the situation of monkeypox across Europe and the US. What are the risks of an outbreak here in South Korea, do you think, very briefly speaking?
Right. I think it's close to none. And also, the KDCA recently reported that we have about 30 million stocks of prevention method available, which they're not going to use because we're in no worries of seeing monkeypox situation here. So I think it's not something majorly we have to worry about currently.
Right, I see. All right, Dr. Kwok, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Fenders over in Busan, thank you for being with us as well.
Thank you.
South Korea's daily COVID-19 tally has dropped below the 20,000 mark on this Thursday. Authorities have announced 18,816 new infections, pushing the country's total caseload to over 18 million. 243 people remain critically ill, and there were 34 additional fatalities. Daily case counts have been on a decline for weeks, with today's tally the lowest for a Thursday in 17 weeks. Meanwhile, South Korea's demographic portrait for the year 2050 is looking quite somber as we look ahead to a shrinking and aging population. Our Lee has a glimpse of that future.
Statistics Korea on Thursday reported its population projection for 2050. It forecast that South Korea's population will drop by over 4 million. The population in 2020 stood at around 51.8 million. But it's expected that there will be approximately 47 million people in 2050 in South Korea. The report goes on to say that the number of people in the working age bracket will also see a dramatic drop. Those aged between 15 to 64 accounted for 72.1% of South Korea's population in 2020. But by 2050, it's likely that this number will drop to a little over 51%. And despite the overall population decline, the proportion of elderly people will more than double from 15.7% in 2020 to 40% in 2050. This raises concerns about growing pressure on the working population to support them. A look at the dependency ratio does nothing to alleviate those concerns. The ratio, which indicates the number of economically inactive people that 100 working people take care of, stood at 38.7 in 2020. By 2050, that's forecasted to surge to 95.8. The rise in the number of older people will coincide with plunging youth population figures. In 2020, around 12% of people living in Korea were aged between 0 and 14. But in 2050, that share is expected to drop to 8.8%. Lee-hyun, Arirang News.
On the corporate front, following investment plans by Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motor earlier this week, two additional South Korean conglomerates have shared similar intentions over the past next 5 years. SK Group, the country's second largest conglomerate by assets, announced Thursday an investment blueprint of some $195 billion, with more than half of this sum earmarked for semiconductors and biopharmaceuticals. Also, over 70% of its total investment will be made here on the local front to revitalize the domestic economy. LG Group has also announced plans to invest about $84 billion over the next 5 years. Nearly half will be directed into future growth engines, including batteries, displays, and AI. On the labor front, both SK and LG have pledged to each create 50,000 new jobs through the year 2026. On the local political front, come June 1st, residents in South Korea will head to polling stations to cast their ballots in the local and parliamentary by-elections. In this following report, our Lee covers efforts by both the ruling and opposition parties to secure voter support.
Following its victory in presidential election, the ruling People Power Party says it needs another victory in the local elections to better serve the public by strengthening cooperation between the central government and regional governments.
Help us work with President Yoon's government by overcoming the obstacles put in place by the opposition party and its domination of parliament.
The main opposition Democratic Party, following its loss of the presidency and as its approval rating slide in the wake of its sexual assault scandal, called for one more chance to serve the public.
If you give our party another chance in the local elections, I will make sure our party brings about a renewal.
In most polls, the PPP is ahead of the DP in terms of approval ratings, which experts attribute to rising approval ratings for President Yoon. But the election outcome remains uncertain in key swing regions. Competing for governor of Gyeonggi-do province are the PPP's Kim Eun-hye, who is President Yoon's former spokesperson, and the DP's Kim Dong-yeon, who emerged his campaign with Yoon's main rival, Lee Jae-myung of the DP. This race for the country's most populous province is shaping up to be as tight as the presidential election, which saw the slimmest margin in history. Lee Jae-myung himself, who was runner-up in the presidential race, is trying to redeem himself through a parliamentary by-election in Incheon's Gyeonggi district. But this race, which was once a sure win for him, is now in doubt, with the PPP's Yoon Hyung-sun catching up.
I've lived here for 25 years serving the community as a doctor. This is my biggest strength as a candidate.
I once represented the whole country as a presidential candidate. I may lack roots in the region, but I have a great deal of experience.
Unfortunately, the candidates won't be able to gauge public sentiment starting Thursday, when polls can no longer be published ahead of 2 days of early voting on Friday and Saturday. Young-eun, Arirang News.
And on the next frontier, South Korea's Nuri space rocket will seek a second launch in mid-June, and this time it's poised to put real satellites into orbit. Our Han Sung-woo reports.
The date is set. On June 15th, South Korea's first fully homegrown space rocket, Nuri, will lift off for the second time. 8 months after its initial launch came short of putting a dummy satellite into orbit. This time, though, it'll be attached with actual satellites, a 180-kilogram performance verification satellite and 4 mini cube satellites that weigh about a kilogram each.
But in second launch, now we have to verify that this launch vehicle can carry satellite which act like the normal satellite, and this satellite will verify the launch vehicle, the second launch vehicle, Nuri, is capable of delivering satellites into the space.
Nuri will soar into the sky from the Naro Space Center in the southern coastal village of Gohung, Jeollanam-do province in the afternoon, likely sometime between 3 and 5 p.m. The Science Ministry and Korea Aerospace Research Institute have reserved June 16th to the 23rd as the rocket's launch window in consideration of variables like bad weather. Currently being assembled and readied for launch, the 3-stage rocket weighs 200 tons and measures 47.2 meters in length.
Launch vehicle is all parts and all assemblies or manufacturings happened inside Korea. So it's a fully Koreanized launch vehicle.
Engineers have reportedly upgraded its 3rd stage, which burned out earlier than expected in October, despite Nuri reaching its target altitude of 700 kilometers. According to officials, a comprehensive interagency drill was conducted last week to prepare for a wide range of emergency situations, including fuel leakages and unapproved drone disruptions. South Korea has invested more than $1.5 billion into the Nuri project since 2010. 한성우, Arirang News.
Build back a better bee. Now, this is the gist of the work by researchers here who've sought to genetically engineer honeybees to make them more resistant to factors that undermine their health, including parasites, pesticides, and climate change. Here's Chung Eun-ju.
There are currently 2.16 million beehives in South Korea. Comparing this to the number of beehives from last year, 2.7 million, roughly 1 in 5 bees have disappeared in the space of a year. The disappearance of bees is a problem as fewer bees to spread pollen takes a toll on crops and decreases honey production. Experts cite the spread of pests caused by climate change as the main reason. Warm winters over the past 2 years have caused flowers to bloom earlier in the year and for shorter periods, resulting in less time for bees to gather nectar. Bees lacking sufficient nutrient intake suffer from weakened immunity and become vulnerable to various diseases.
Climate change has caused various pests such as bee mites to thrive, and the excessive use of pesticides has caused a decrease in the number of bees.
South Korean scientists have developed genetically modified bees that can withstand fatal diseases. Called Jangwon honeybee, they look similar to normal bees but can produce large amounts of virus-resistant proteins. They can fend off varroa mites that feed off bee larvae to spread viruses, steal nutrients, and weaken a bee's immune system. During testing, the Jangwon honeybee didn't become ill even when infected with viruses, and their ability to collect honey improved by 1.3 times. Technology to increase the number of native bees has also been developed. Native bees are congenitally incapable of being infected by varroa mites, but became endangered after the spread of the sackbrood virus a decade ago. The same research team has developed the halla bee that is completely immune to the sackbrood virus.
This breed was selected by first collecting bees from an area where native bees lived, testing pest resistance of those bees, and passing on their strength through dozens of generations.
The research team has plans to develop types of bee that can withstand warmer temperatures so they can respond to climate change. Chung Eun-ju, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the UK, an official report detailing a series of illegal parties at the British Prime Minister's Downing Street residence has seen lawmakers confronting Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The report describes events that took place during the country's COVID-19 lockdown measures, where ordinary citizens couldn't socialize outside their homes or even attend funerals for loved ones. Released on Wednesday, it includes photos of the parties, some of which the Prime Minister attended. Johnson has received criticism and renewed calls for his resignation from lawmakers, including those from his own party. Although he says he takes full responsibility for the incidents, Johnson has refused to step down. In India's northeast Assam state, floods and landslides over the last 10 days have killed at least 25 people. Officials on Tuesday also say more than 650,000 people have been displaced from their homes. Amid heavy rain, the Brahmaputra River, one of the largest rivers in the world, burst its banks in Assam, submerging over 1,800 villages in 26 districts this month. Authorities have set up 366 relief camps across 20 districts, providing temporary shelter for more than 95,000 people. Weather forecasts predict further thunderstorms in the state over the next 10 days. Looking to Afghanistan now, where several explosions in the capital Kabul and the north of the country on Wednesday killed at least 14 people. An explosion at a mosque in the capital killed at least 5 worshippers and injured 22. And 3 bombings of minivans in the country's northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif killed 9 passengers, with another 15 injured. So far, no one has claimed responsibility for the explosions, but according to reports, they showed signs linking them to an affiliate of the Islamic State group, known as ISIS-K. In a move to more aggressively protect the Amazon rainforest, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is increasing fines for environmental crimes. Bolsonaro signed a decree on Tuesday which will see stricter measures against those falsifying documents to cover up illegal logging. It also details heavier consequences for repeat environmental offenders. The measures to combat illegal deforestation also include penalties for unauthorized hunting, fishing, and pollution. The decree goes into effect immediately and marks one of the first concrete steps by Bolsonaro's government to bolster Amazon protections, following its commitment to end illegal deforestation by 2028. Turning over to Peru, where clowns took to the capital street to spread cheer on Wednesday. The event celebrated Peru's traditional Clown Day and saw big shoes, colorful faces, and original wigs being worn in a bid to bring smiles to the Lima locals. Peruvians have celebrated Clown Day since 1987 as a tribute to the late clown Jose Alvarez Velez, known as the Clown of the Poor. Going by the name Tony Perejil, Velez used to carry a multicolored tent and visit Lima neighborhoods in the 1980s to spread joy. He eventually spent his last days alone and bedridden in a hospital. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Thursday afternoon. As a cold air mass is pushing down from the north, it's much cooler than yesterday. But we do have more rain in the forecast, mainly in central and northern regions overnight. There won't be much at around 5 millimeters. Still, it could be followed by stormy conditions. And temperature-wise, central regions are going to be fresher and breezier, with Seoul reaching 23 and Daegu, the warmest city in Korea, at 28 degrees, and that is 5 degrees lower than yesterday. And meanwhile, those in mountainous areas of Gangwon-do province have been warned to brace against strong gales of up to 25 meters per second, which is strong enough to make the street furniture to fly around. So please take extra precautions if you're out and about there. And after the rain peters out tomorrow morning, temperatures are set to rise again over the weekend, with another round of rain across the country on Monday. Now, let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
And on that note, we say goodbye. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us again tomorrow.